Hello and welcome back to the Dynasty Crossroads. My name's Peter Howard at Pahowdy on Twitter. This is a member of the DLF family of podcasts, unsponsored, unadvertised, unimportant. So welcome back to Crossroads. This episode is a couple days late, but like always, I have reasons. One is I'm trying to switch over to my in-season schedule slowly, and I don't exactly know what that's going to be yet. Now, in-season, we typically aimed for right about after the waiver wire ran, essentially because I'm less interested in creating a top 5 list of players to go add. I try and stay more Dynasty focused, even in season, looking for trends, looking for who's having a good or a better season, more depth charts. In other words, I'm more interested in players that might be still on the waiver wire after the waiver wire runs than I am players who might be addable or targets on a waiver wire in a particular week. And also players that should already be rostered. So, I never felt a great need to push it out before actionable things had to take place in season. I stayed very much Dynasty focused, but also it just seemed to be a good dead zone. Like after the waiver wire podcast run, quite often there was a lack of other podcasts to listen to before that week's games. Slates tended to be broken down between waiver wire shows and the actual waiver wire, and after the waiver wire there's just the games to look forward to, and so there tended to be a lack of podcast draft, and I liked inserting it into that space because, again, this podcast isn't meant to necessarily be the most actionable, immediate content, although occasionally we do find stuff. It's more meant to be if you've got 30 minutes that you want to listen to, or hear someone talk, or talk with someone else about Dynasty, oftentimes more holistically, just developing an understanding of different situations, of different statistics, and also different situations, in order that you can make better decisions without, having to at me or at anyone else, which you're always free to do. You got 33 minutes and you want to listen to a podcast about football, that's where I come in. I'm not looking to make decisions on your team or tell you how to win or not win, so much as just talk to you about football for 30 minutes when you feel like that would be a fun thing to do and there's no one else around. That's me. In the off season, I've mostly been aiming for Saturdays, mostly just because of my work schedule. It worked out pretty well. I could record it, edit it by the end of the week, and put it out on the weekends, because also I don't see a lot of podcasts dropped on the weekends. Mostly we drop them in the week. People listen to them throughout the week. So in other words, on Sunday when I went for my run, my podcast queue was empty. I'd already burnt through them all, and I thought that might be a good hole for the off season. According to a Twitter poll, and anything you guys get back to me, either in the comments on the YouTube video, or in a view, or, at me on Twitter at some point, Monday might be that space for you in the in-season, in the 2021 season. So I'm currently aiming to record the Dynasty Crossroads, edit it, and get it out for you all on Monday. For you all, all 7 of you, and myself. That makes 8. We just went up a viewer. Awesome. So, Monday is the plan right now. I don't know what that means for the weekly stream, though, because I do want to be available. I do like streaming. I like being able to talk about football, pretty obviously, and doing it live is always fun, so I'm thinking... Oh, wait. That was awkward. Anyway, I might have to move the Monday grind to maybe the Tuesday or the end of the week grind, and start asking if you have any questions or immediate things or weekly events or situations that you want an opinion on from whatever the hell my perspective is, and that way I can cover those in the Monday grind or the live stream, which might need a new name depending on when we find time to actually do that in our schedule. So that's where I'm at right now with the in-season schedule. We got a couple weeks. I thought it was about time we started talking about it and planning for it. Speaking of which, the subject for this week's podcast is going to be what I'm doing with weekly projections, just because that's what I've been doing lately. And also, I thought it was pretty interesting, and it spat out some things that I think could be really interesting at the very start of the season. Now, again, when we're Dynasty focused, we tend to be more long-term view, but that is kind of a longer-term view that most are giving you right now. The closer we get to the season, the more people are going to start talking about the strength of schedule through the first 3 weeks, which is useless because it's based on games that no longer apply to the strength of schedule, and adjusting it based on how good we think players are, which is really where those things are made. Although I would say Warren Sharp on Twitter, and also he has a website, and you know who Warren Sharp is. I do find his positional specific. He actually has graphs and charts. If you go check out the website, I forget the actual name of that. I'm assuming it's just warrensharp.com. Because you can look at it from a position specific basis, and defenses versus that specific offensive position, and he seems to have more luck than I've seen with most strengths of schedules, and that's not a plug, and he doesn't even know who I am, so I'm certainly getting money for it. I just find that a fun way to look if you're interested in the strengths of schedule, but I didn't mean to go too far off the rails with that. Where was I? Oh yeah. So right now it is a little bit more long term to think about week 1, week 2, week 3, who might show up early, which will have a dramatic effect on dynasty value, and also, since we're trying to win, our weekly points advantage. And so some names showed up just based on this early version of a weekly projection model, so I thought I'd talk to you about how I'm doing weekly projections, what they mean, because I'm looking at it through a slightly different lens and trying to actually guess, which is essentially what we're doing, what's actually going to happen on a week-to-week basis. I'm sliding the goal of my projections. Now I'm free from Player Profiler and other places that were using my projections, like which have a very specific goal, which is to win at DFS, and by specifically projecting more accurate numbers for those players. I'm more interested in doing something else for the 2020 season, so I'm going to tell you what I'm doing, what I think it might be useful for, and how it might be useful, and then where it's going to be. And so if you're interested in that, you've probably already stuck around, but if not, then, thanks for checking out the intro. I appreciate it. I do. Anyway, so yeah, you can see this podcast live on YouTube if you're bored of listening to it and you want to see my smiling face. While doing it as well, with some interesting background music as well. Cool. We add that in now. We got skills. We're learning. We're developing the craft, as it were. I can't do this host stuff. Let's just move on. So, although I am wearing a Scott Fishbowl shirt from last year, it's pretty lit. It's Lego themed and everything. It's pretty neat. Anyway, weekly projections. So, what I got increasingly interested in doing while trying to recreate a new projection model, not for any specific reason, because increasingly I'm trying to understand where I'm at in this fantasy football space and how the heck I got here. I feel like the Joker from that Batman movie, but I'm just a dog chasing a car, and I seem to have caught the tail end of one, and I don't really know how I got here or what to do with it. So something I've been realizing lately is I've never really had a goal. I didn't set out to create perfect videos or perfect projections or perfect player takes or a wide receiver model or just take over the industry with my perfect content and then present it. I've more of just found stuff interesting while playing fantasy football, found out you can follow and they will tell you exactly how they do most things, the real geniuses behind the curtain in the kitchen of fantasy football, working on statistics and finding edges. Like, you can follow them and talk to them and they will tell you how, and all you have to do is be willing to actually learn or refresh yourself on a little bit of math and do a little bit of legwork. And you can learn how it's going on, and then you constantly find yourself really annoyed by people who post the end result with no understanding of where that actually comes from and why the conclusion is entirely unrelated to the stats they're using, like vacated targets or using split stats, and eventually your manic craziness on Twitter leads to people finding that fun, and also they like free data and maybe not doing some of the legwork themselves, and then you get me. I find things interesting, I'm trying to learn about them while having fun playing fantasy football, I'm really enjoying the community, and then, you end up here, and I have no clear direction or path or thing that is me. So, that's where I'm at. And it's the same with projections. Like, I started doing it because I thought it was interesting, I got asked to do it seriously for Player Profiler, and so I kind of knuckled down there and did some real work for a while. And now, looking at projections, I was just like, why not create a new model? Why not? I got time. And I think it would be interesting to recreate it, applying what I've learned from doing it over the last few years and being relatively successful at it, to a new model. And then I was like, nah, it's really hard work and boring. How could I create one that just spits out a number that I don't necessarily have to adjust or justify or find out what's gone wrong or readjust things to what's actually reasonable? Because no projection model is actually as complicated as even my mind when looking at the end results. You can be like, oh, well, I see that they're over projecting because of touchdown efficiency that happened over the last few weeks or whatever else. Instead, I just don't want to have to do that. It's real hard work. In fact, so is this. But I got interested in the idea of just being able to plug in Vegas lines and project what Vegas is telling us they think players are going to do. Now, obviously, they're not telling us what they think players are going to do. Those are prop bets. But here's the thing. I was using Vegas lines to stabilize volume on a week-to-week basis for seasonal projections last year, and I found a few interesting things about them. One, they're no more predictive than most projection models, and it's better to think of them as Vegas's best bet on what's a good over-under line that they're going to make the most money, not necessarily this industry standard of how many points is actually going to happen into a game. What's the over-under line we have to set to make enough people bet and lose money to us? That's really Vegas. But there is a lot of adjustment. If a quarterback goes out, for example, they adjust the line based on who his replacement is. So if Trey Lance takes over from Jimmy Garoppolo, we're going to see them make a very researched, because they've got a lot of money riding on it, opinion on whether to adjust the line up or down. So I can do that research myself, or I can just take theirs. That's a lot of research. That's interesting. And I also know from using Vegas in my weekly projections model last year that I can project volume. I can stabilize fairly well the volume we expect in any particular game in the rushing and the passing game. So that's interesting. The only problem is with a Vegas line, essentially what they give us, or if you're not going to go down into player props or anything else, is they give you a game total, and from that you can and a spread. So whether a team's going to win by 3 points or lose by 3 points based on if they're an underdog or the favorite, or whatever number they happen to put on that variance and the potential finishing in that game line. So in other words, from what Vegas gives us as an industry standard, and Vegas is actually a composite term, there are lots of Vegas lines. We all just tend to refer to a common average, but anyway. From that Vegas line, say a team is projected for 51.5 points, as right now Arizona is in week 1, but these Vegas lines will change as we get closer, which is one of the things. They're doing research and they're adjusting their line, and I can just change the number. I don't have to do any of that research, and I thought that was interesting. So Arizona is projected for 51.5 points in week 1. So that means with a spread of 3, and they're the favorite, which means if we divide that 51.5 number by 2, we essentially get a version of a team projection in points, how many touchdowns and field goals they're going to score. But there's also that spread. They're not going to score the exact number of points. So if you adjust the favorite and the underdog by that 3 spread, I'm probably teaching you to suck eggs right now, but bear with me, then we can actually get a team projection instead of just a game projection, and you have to run through that process. Vegas lines don't typically spit out team projections or for a week's game, but it's fairly simple calculation, so you'll find it on pretty much any website. And I can do that fairly easily because I can divide by 2 as well. Barely. Alright. So Arizona's projected 51.5 yards with a spread of 3 in week 1. Adjusting right now, this is one of the areas I want to improve the model. All I'm doing is saying that each team is going to score at least 1 field goal, and I'm assuming there's a better way of doing it. But for right now, just to get it running, that's what I did. I divided by 2, adjusted by the spread, whether the favorite or the underdog, to create a team projection, minus 3 points for a single field goal, and then I divided that number by touchdowns, by 7 points, 6 and the field and the extra point. Because again, you know what that is, but I'm teaching you to suck eggs, so here we go. So essentially that creates a touchdown projection, and that's interesting and something that I was using for my weekly projections as well, because you could see if you were going too hard or too soft on a particular game or player projection based on if that player team, once you summed everything up, was producing too many touchdowns or too few touchdowns based on Vegas. But that's an actual stat that we can apply to players. That's not suddenly a team points. which is unrelated to fantasy. Instead, we've got touchdowns. Now, touchdowns are related to fantasies. Normally the thing we pay the least attention to, and yet scores the most points, and has the highest, because it has the highest week-to-week variance, we tend to avoid it in terms of projection, but they are highly effective in identifying who's going to score the most points. That with touchdowns is kind of everything, especially at the tight end position, but also the other positions as well. You've only got 3 touchdowns if you're lucky scored in an individual game. Who catches that touchdown, especially if they're getting volume on top of it, is relatively important. You might have heard of this since you presumably play fantasy football, and I've gone way too far. Either way, so taking that spread and that game projection currently for week 1 in Arizona, that means that they should score 3 touchdowns in week 1 according to Vegas, or that's their over-under line at least. So how much can we play with that number? Turns out kind of a lot, actually. So what I used for an assumption before the season is my seasonal projections. I just went back into my seasonal model and I created some expectations on touchdown efficiency and team splits in rushing touchdowns and passing touchdowns based on what we're projecting for the season proper, because there's a lot of, I think, good research behind those already, and so I just borrow my own research. I don't have to plug everything in and regression model my way to the numbers that we should expect in an individual game for 2021. Instead, just take what we expect for season long, and we'll use that until we get enough weeks in 2021 to start using the actual data from that season. Right now, I think that's going to happen around week 3, and we'll try it, see if it's too varied, or maybe we'll wait to week 4, which is usually where things start to stabilize. Alright, so where was I? I was telling 3 touchdowns for Arizona week 1. Well, based on my projections, Arizona should score about 42% of their touchdowns in the rushing game and 57% of their touchdowns in the receiving game. There are decimal points there. Don't tell me that doesn't add up to 100. I just don't want to decimal point you to death on a podcast. Give me a break. So, on average, by the way, that's not a pro team wide receiver take or anything. That's not a 0 running back take. That's actually conforms to the average for my projections, but also based on the last 3 to 5 years of NFL data. For example, on average, teams score about 38% of their touchdowns in the rushing game and 61% of the touchdowns to the receiving game. I'm not devaluing the rushing game. This isn't a 0 RB podcast right now, at least. All right. So if we take that percentage or that expected split in their touchdowns and apply that to the 3 touchdowns we're projecting for week 1, we get 1.3 rushing touchdowns and 1.7 receiving touchdowns. Now that's not, we need whole touchdowns eventually, but at least is interesting because now we can divide those touchdowns into different player categories based on who's going to get rushing touchdowns and receiving touchdowns. Interesting. We can also project yards based on the efficiency we expect for that offense in my projections right now, but hopefully and soon switching it over to actual data in the 2021 season, because they get a certain number of yards per every touchdown. That's a number that because it's an efficiency number that regresses wildly as all efficiency numbers do, but here's the thing about yards per touchdown, it does actually regress to the average, unlike most efficiency stats until you have a significant sample size. Like players regress to their own average once you see them play 3 or 4 years. Devontae Adams at this point just has a higher touchdown efficiency expectancy than, say, Jarvis Landry or pretty much anyone else, actually. That's just a Devontae Adams thing. And there are a few other players with that as well. If they have enough sample, you can say they're just more efficient than most in the touchdown. And yes, that probably has something to do with Aaron Rodgers. But on a team level, that's true too. It will vary wildly week to week, but because they regress to a season-long average in general, then it is a reasonable assumption, a reasonable medium projection for the team that if Arizona scores 3.1 rushing touchdowns, which will actually obviously just be 1 rushing touchdown and 2 receiving touchdowns, then they should rush for around 141 yards, because that's about the efficiency we're projecting in the seasonal model. Again, in 2021, my seasonal model might be wildly off, and that shoots up to 200 yards per touchdown, and they're actually rushing for a lot fewer yards. per touchdown, or the other way as well, but that's where we need 2021 data to really get a decent expectation for this season. But for right now, I think that's a reasonable expectation based on all the assumptions that went into my seasonal model. They also score a receiving touchdown for every 349 receiving yards, so a lot more receiving yards have to happen before you get a receiving touchdown, essentially, in the Arizona offense. But they're also passing for a lot more. It's a pass-heavy offense and everything else. So now we have a team projection of touchdowns and yards, and that's interesting, but we're still not on players, and that's what we want. We want Vegas to project our players. Now notice we've already made some assumptions here. We're making assumptions about the offense's touchdown efficiency, the split of touchdowns in the rushing and receiving game, so it's not just what Vegas tells us, it's what we think those Vegas numbers tell us if we make a few minor reasonable assumptions that will adjust as we get different information from the 2021 season. Alright, so that's where this projection model switches over to from a Vegas projecting team model to a Vegas projecting player model. And it runs through a fairly simple process, just exactly the same process really, but on a player-based level. So what I do is look up, for right now, my seasonal projections on players receiving yards per touchdown and rushing yards per touchdown. I also look up how likely we expect them to be involved in the receiving and rushing touchdown game. So let's stick with Arizona. Right now we're expecting DeAndre Hopkins, or I'm expecting DeAndre Hopkins to have about 31.7% of that team's receiving touchdowns. That's very high, and that's the kind of thing I think this kind of methodology can show you, but anyway. But that's where it is. And so if we take the projections that we just created using Vegas numbers and apply that to our expectation for how the percentage of touchdowns we expect DeAndre Hopkins to get, now suddenly we have a DeAndre Hopkins touchdown projection for week 1. And you can see how this funnels backwards into all the other targets from touchdowns from Vegas lines. And I think that's just really interesting, and so I just kept playing with it. Is it good? I actually think it's going to be reasonably good at projecting what I'm interested in, but we'll see, I guess. Alright, so once you have receiving touchdowns, you can project yards based on receiving yards per touchdown, and that's, again, something that regresses on a player's average. And with someone like DeAndre Hopkins, we can be reasonably certain of what he's going to get. And so if DeAndre Hopkins gets 0.54 of that receiving touchdown total we mentioned, because that's what 31% of it is, then he should catch around 110 yards. So we're expecting him to be a little inefficient in terms of touchdowns, because I'd expect most receivers to get a touchdown if they catch 100 yards, but not always. And that's part of the problem of using seasonal projections for an in-game projection. But again, I think they're reasonable assumptions to really start the season with, and so we're rolling with it. And from there, we can create receptions and targets based on, again, what we expect DeAndre Hopkins to do on a season-broad level when you backtrack those stats that way. And that essentially means we've gone from a Vegas team game projection all the way to a DeAndre Hopkins target projection, and now we're starting to look like an actual projection model by running through Vegas to the team, to the player, making some reasonable expectations of their role in that offense. Now, unfortunately, no one wants to hear about how DeAndre Hopkins is going to score 0.54 touchdowns, but they do need some level of touchdown projection in order to get those yards, since we're funneling it through yards. So what I did is remove those from their stat line and actually just rank them in terms of what we're expecting them to be in the receiving game for touchdowns, on the rushing game for touchdowns, and then project, the person who's most likely to catch a touchdown to catch the first touchdown, the person who's second most likely to catch a touchdown to catch the second touchdown, and so on. Now, rarely will Vegas ever project 4 touchdowns, but it's in there just in case. And rushing touchdowns, it rarely projects more than 1, but we've got it in there up to 4, just in case there's a heavy game with a team that rushes a lot, So, again, I shouldn't have to rewrite that formula, I'm hoping. That's just kind of a side note. But we're not going to project everyone to score a little bit of a touchdown or a little bit of a rushing touchdown. We're going to project whole touchdowns based on, for right now, who we expect is most likely to score a touchdown, second most likely and third most likely in the receiving and the rushing game. Which also means, and it's something I also want to work on, we're never going to project a player for more than 2 touchdowns. Which needs some work, I grant you. but we'll take it for right now since we're talking about 1 and 2 touchdowns. Yeah, whatever. All right. And from there, we can create, the quarterback's overall projection is still a function of the players, but their touchdowns, literally their passing touchdowns, is created by that process. You just sum up the touchdowns we're expecting from that team, which should and does directly match the Vegas projection we actually created at the very start. And so all the game lines match up with the projections that we're actually putting out. And so my projections match perfectly on a team level what Vegas is saying, and then we can also see what Vegas's game total thinks or suggests the game is actually going to have, so we can see what that game total projects in terms of rushing yards, receiving yards, and touchdowns. And then my player model is filtering all that into how that likely splits up based on the current expected roles of my seasonal projections. And that's it. I've built it. I would just have to input. I do have there's a few others as well, areas I want to work on, but that would mean we just need to continuously update Vegas lines. And instead of projecting, this is what I think DeAndre Hopkins is going to do, instead now I have a player projection line heavily based on what Vegas is saying, with just some major, but some reasonable major expectations of his role in that offense. And I think that's an interesting projection. This has been really long. Or that felt really long. Did it feel really long to you? It felt really long to me. Anyway, so let me give you an example. And one of the names that pops up to me is because currently I have Trey Lance as the quarterback who's going to start the season. Not because I know that's going to happen, or I'm ranking him. That's not what I'm doing. It's just I think the market right now is really expecting strong things from Trey Lance. So I think it would be interesting to see, based on the Vegas line right now, what Trey Lance would do. And he comes up as quarterback 4 because the team projection is 26.8 points. That's like a top 3, top 5 projection for the week on a team level. They're also playing away, and they are heavy favorites, so the spread is in their favor. And that's creating an expectation that the team is going to score at least 2 passing touchdowns, because San Francisco last year was a heavily passing. My seasonal projections project them to score a lot more receiving touchdowns than passing touchdowns. In fact, let me just skip back so I can actually say a number and make it sound like I know what I'm talking about. I'm projecting only 26% of the touchdowns to come from the rushing game, despite them being a heavy rushing team, and that's likely incorrect. Again, it's showing up things that don't necessarily pass a sniff test on a game-by-game projection, but that's what I want it to do, rather than it be an accurate representation. But that is interesting that that's what it spit out after taking into account what happened last year and the scheme proper, and using all the assumptions we put in as reasonably as we could to the season-long projection. We're expecting more receiving touchdowns. Part of a function is you really can't kick Deebo Samuels out this offense in projections, and we're having to heavily push up Brandon Ayuk's role to account for how we feel his season might project in 2021, and that's partly why that receiving touchdown number has become, in my opinion, slightly out of balance. You have to give him a larger touchdown role that is really reasonable with George Kittle still on the roster, and it just bumps up their touchdowns in the receiving game. So again, that's something I think this game projection from Vegas is kind of show up. Either way, where was I? Alright, so let's look at San Francisco in week 1 and see what else we can notice. The other thing I noticed about San Francisco in week 1 is Trey Sermon is projected as running back 30, because I currently have a heavy split, because we don't really know how that situation's going to work out in San Francisco, with Trey Sermon getting the lead role, but with a team getting a heavy receiving touchdown expectation based on our off-season gamblings on what the San Francisco 49ers are going to do with Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, and George Kittle. It means that there's a lack of work in the rushing game go around. I don't think that's entirely true, and I don't have to. This is just a reasonable expectation based on the Vegas line and what we've ended up doing to this team, or our thoughts on this team this offseason. We can disagree with it and see it as an edge against Vegas lines when we're making DFS lineups or making decisions for week 1 start sits for that matter. On the other hand, we've got George Kittle going as tight end 2, which I think is very reasonable. Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel both being top 4 wide receivers, and again we see the problem with our current expectation of the 49ers offense and of Trey Lance, because Trey Lance has relatively little stats to base his NFL season on. He's probably not getting as much work in the rushing game, and the San Francisco 49ers aren't producing enough in the rushing game based on everything we're expecting in the receiving game for the San Francisco 49ers this offseason, because that's really what my seasonal projections are trying to do, where we're at with these teams going into 2021. And so instead of saying, well, that means I have to start all my 49ers week 1, it looks like they're in a good game script right now, according to Vegas, with some really interesting players. All of these guys are fairly high drafted and are going to be on rosters. None of them are waiver wire ads. But even with Jimmy Garoppolo gets a start, this is an interesting game, unless Vegas changes the line significantly before the 2021 season, because these are really a week-to-week. I've had to reach really far into the future. For a Vegas line, you really typically don't use it until you're in that week. I'm just trying to get an early look. And so that's kind of what I hope for these projections, that you can see what seems reasonable and what seems unreasonable, and then maybe find some edges that way. And also, Vegas isn't terrible, and it is based on a lot of research of what we expect to happen in 2021. So, you're borrowing brilliance, I guess, to use a Kevin O'Brien term, and just taking that Vegas net projection, making some reasonable assumptions, and then seeing what that spits out for fantasy on a player level. Anyway, some other things to end this on a maybe sounds like something you might have wanted to listen to note. Running backs that finish in the top 12 that I think are remarkably interesting, because they're in high-scoring games with teams that should score a significant amount of their touchdowns in the rushing game compared to the spread of teams in general. Mike Davis, Darrel Henderson, and both in fairly high-scoring games in Week 1. And Darrel Henderson's in one currently projected to have a 26-point team total. And Mike Davis is... I lost him. Oh, I changed that a little bit. He's now down here running back 19. No, who else was I thinking of? Darrel Henderson and... I keep adjusting this, sorry. David Montgomery, but let's not go there yet. Let's just stick with Darrel Henderson. Now, obviously, we're probably expecting more from the rushing game in my seasonal projections right now than we actually do based on the recent Cam Akers injury. And so that's why Darrel Henderson is shooting up there, because we're expecting more production from the team level in the rushing game than we now expect with the adjustment of Darrel Henderson. However, it's also because Darrel Henderson is in a 26-point game as a heavy home favorite against Chicago, with a favorable spread, and he's more likely to be the runner who gets a touchdown if the team gets a touchdown, and so the model is assigning him the rushing touchdown in that offense, and in a heavy spread or in a heavy scoring game, it's actually producing on a team level. Should have looked this up first. I didn't know we were going to go here though, so... Yeah, Rams. We're actually projecting about 2 rushing touchdowns based on our expectation for the Rams in 2021, or my expectations for the Rams in 2021. Again, I think that's interesting, because I don't think Darrel Henderson's a top 4 running back. I don't think he's going to be necessarily top 12 week 1, although that would be, lots of memes going around week 1 if Darrel Henderson were to go off that strong. What it does suggest to me is we're too enamored with the Rams' rushing attack, especially with the loss of Cam Akers right now. We should probably expect more coming from the receiving game, especially with the addition of Matt Stafford, Rob Woods, and Cooper Kupp still on the roster. And with the loss of Cam Akers, we now know the Vegas line is splitting it up through this model to provide too much to the rushing game, and so we might even have an even higher expectation for Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods in this here very week 1 against who they facing? Detroit. No, I read that wrong. Sorry, Chicago. Yeah, that should be a fun game. So, what does that mean? It means I think Darrel Henderson's definitely a start week 1 if you draft him as a running back 2, but I'm not expecting top 12 production. I'm actually more interested that it says we should expect more out of the receiving game than we were for most of the offseason, and that's something some people might miss in DFS, perhaps. I haven't looked at that yet. Or on weekly start-to-sit decisions. But again, that's just week one. We're not really using projections this heavily or looking for edges in projections this heavily in week one. Again, by the time we get some 2020 data so we can update this from our seasonal projections, I think it might get really interesting. Anyway, that's what I'm running right now and what I'm trying to perfect and get better and get to a place where I am happy to just change the Vegas numbers and post it. I'm putting it in the same link that I've put the seasonal projections. Right now it's just hosted on Patreon. I've asked DLF if they can use me in any way in projections or if this would be an interesting look. Michael Zingoni has been holding down projections for DLF for the last year, at least the last 2 years, and he does an amazing job. So we just have this free and clear for right now. And yeah, I'm going to be posting weekly projections based off this model, making content around it, and also making fantasy decisions, hopefully based on the conclusions I draw from looking at it. But again, I think it's just interesting to have a model that's spitting out market or consumer or the crowd expectation of what might happen, taking Vegas as a proxy for that, and then making some very small but significant assumptions, but reasonable assumptions, to turn that into player expectations for week one. And I think we could find a number of different averages on a weekly and also on a dynasty long basis with that kind of view. I think it's interesting. Let me know what you think, though. At Pahowdy on Twitter, same thing on YouTube, or wherever else you like to consume fantasy content, pretty much. My writing's all at DLF. That's it. That's all the plugs you get. I know you love plugs, but that's all the ones I'm doing today. Anyway, I really appreciate it. Let me know what you think about this and what you think about Darrel Henderson week one. Top 4 running backs seem a little strong. I think it seems a little strong, but definitely means that he's very much a potential starter for us in week one. Going to underline that. I think he's both going to disappoint and impress in week one based on the disparity of takes I hear on Darrel Henderson. I think he's going to be solid. I think it's a good start this year, and I think that's what it's spitting out for week one, or what this is kind of showing based on Vegas's current expectation for their week one game. Anyway, I'm going to get off the Darrel Henderson bandwagon here for a second to say thanks very much for checking out the Crossroads. I will talk to you again next week. Maybe with a guest, who knows, and from now on we're going to start shifting very slowly to the start of the week, Monday and Tuesday type drops for the Dynasty Crossroads instead of Saturday and Sunday drops. Let me know if that's not the best schedule, but that's the opinion, and also kind of backs up my experience with podcasts so far during NFL seasons, but I'm interested in other opinions if you have any. Let me know. Thanks very much. Talk to you next week. Bye.